Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Answers from the Lab, where we share Mayo Clinic knowledge and advancements on the state of testing and science from laboratory leaders and the people who are making it happen behind the scenes. I'm Dr. Bobbi Pritt, Interim Chair of the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. With me today is Dr. Bill Morice, the President and CEO of Mayo Clinic Laboratories. Hi, Bill. Welcome back.
Hi, Bobbi. Good to see you, as always.
As always, every week. It's great. Well, we have a few things to talk about today. Of course, one of the big things that is on everyone's mind is FDA regulation of lab-developed tests and when that's going to come out. I don't have any answers. I wish I did. Bill, what have you been hearing?
Well, I think I'm with you. I mean, no one knows the answers to that, to the key question. We know that the final rule has been submitted to the Office of Management and Budget at White House, but when it will be released, a lot of people think it will be in the next couple of weeks, but there's no certainty. So it's kind of like waiting for the other shoe to drop here. So we'll see. There's a lot of different ins and outs for why people speculate. It's a great weekend for it, getting out, before this whatever 50-day rule, whatever it is, where an agency decision can be overturned by the next Congress. There's all these sorts of things that are out there that are making people speculate that it's going to be very soon, but the fact of the matter is we just really don't know.
Yeah, we really don't know. I wish I had that crystal ball. I guess regardless, it's hard to prepare because we don't know what the final rule will look like. And of course, if it's going to be enforced and how quickly. But we will keep everyone informed on that as soon as we hear. But Meanwhile, I thought we could also talk about innovation and the importance of lab-developed tests and why we have to find a way to go forward with these just for our patients. And I think a really important area, as many of our population are aging, is Alzheimer's disease and testing for that. That's an area where some new lab-developed tests have shown some very good promise in early diagnosis.
Yeah, so first of all, you're right. We can control what we can control. We know we need to continue to push the envelope in the diagnostic laboratory the way that we always have, in ways that are safe and effective to provide insights for patients. There's a lot of interest in cognitive impairment. Just more if you just step back and take because there's a lot of different diseases. Alzheimer's one, just about everyone knows about. There's Lewy body. There's a lot of different forms of these disorders. To your point, there's also a lot of good evidence that this is going to be, or predictions, I should say, that these diseases are going to become a significant burden for healthcare and for societies over the next several decades as we age, particularly as the birth rate drops, as people live longer. So the question is, how do we identify those individuals early enough that as we come up with new therapies, and those therapies are being introduced, they can actually be introduced to patients at a time when you can slow or even stop the progression of the disease? Because the reality is that's going to be the key here, is going to be slowing or stopping progression. Once it hits a certain stage, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. So a lot of good tests that are out there that are being developed, some even by our own DLMP.
Right. Exactly. And we could talk about one of them that we recently did a podcast on with Dr. Algeciras, and that is the phospho-tau 217 test. It is from plasma. So just a little reminder for people who haven't been thinking about this or maybe didn't catch that podcast. It is a relatively non-invasive way to look for possible assess a patient for Alzheimer's disease if they're age 50 or older and maybe have some cognitive impairment. And it's one of several factors that could be used to help make a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And as just a brief review, there's two main neurologic features we see in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. It's the plaques and the tangles. So the plaques are made of beta amyloid peptides, and then there are these intracellular neurofibrillary tangles containing hyperphosphorylated tau, p-tau. So that's what we're detecting with this new plasma-based test. But this is really just part of a toolbox for detecting Alzheimer's disease. It's complex, as you know, Bill. And actually, I think you've been involved in some of the early work on this and can maybe tell us a bit more about the history of this test.
Well, sure. Actually, when I was in medical school, the first thing I was going to be actually was a neurologist. I spent a couple
Oh, I
years.
didn't know that.
Yeah, it was
Fun.
with Dr. Bill Carnes, who I think unfortunately has passed away. Used to take me around his clinic in the afternoon. So yeah, I've thought about this for a while. You're right. So the plaques, amyloid plaques and tangles are really what are looked for in Alzheimer's disease in particular to make the specific diagnosis. Um, this has really been what people have been looking for, because right now the standard of care has been, if you have a patient with mild cognitive impairment and you want to make the diagnosis, is to send them for PET scanning to look for these neurodegenerative changes, the plaques in particular, right? So finding first now blood-based. So we have had some CSF, cerebrospinal fluid-based biomarker testing to look for these abnormal proteins that are associated with these abnormal structures in the brain. But that's an invasive test. It's a lot of I've done them. They're not that difficult, but there can be complications with headache and other things afterwards. So wasn't ideal. So now to have blood-based biomarkers, blood-based testing for the same proteins that are associated with these abnormalities is really important, right? Because it makes it much more possible that you can start to screen patients for potential Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot of questions that these tests raise as well. I think the most important thing we could talk about this is that it just shows, going back to opening with FDA, it's very rare that we just develop a test in isolation. The most important thing right now is these tests are available. We know they work, but we need to really stay closely embedded with the clinical practice to understand how they actually drive decision making in the clinic.
Yeah, it really needs to be part of a full clinical assessment, perhaps in conjunction with imaging, the PET scan, as you mentioned, other tests as well. But it's nice to have something that's relatively non-invasive as a starting test, especially as you said, with an aging population. And now that we're starting to see some drugs that are going to be potentially useful in treating Alzheimer's, it's great to get an early diagnosis and perhaps start treatment early.
Yeah, so that you're right, and I think that's kind of how my understanding, and there's not actually great unanimity, I don't think, in the neurology community. But my understanding is that for patients that are exhibiting symptoms, that this blood-based testing,
Mhm.
but it might be an upfront screen to identify who needs to go for PET scanning, since PET scanning is expensive, right? And then potentially even after the diagnosis has been made, now that we have more effective therapies, I think the next question will be, can this be used to actually monitor response to treatment, right? Because right now that all hinges on kind of the clinical presentation and as well as the radiologic findings. So finding another piece of data that can be used both upfront for screening and diagnosis, and then for monitoring, treatment and efficacy or effectiveness, going to be hugely important for what's a very common disease. There's still a lot, and the other thing though is that we need to stay engaged as laboratorians as we bring these into practice, because there's a lot about the disease that we don't understand. So we don't understand yet how strong the correlate. We do understand somewhat, but there's not a one-to-one correlation between the blood-based biomarker findings and the radiologic findings. That's why we still need to learn this. They're very close, right? And the other is that my understanding is that even the radiologic findings are not necessarily one-to-one, where the number of plaques equates to the degree of clinical impairment and those sorts of things. So there's a lot to be learned, but the most important thing is to make the test available, and to continue to use it when appropriate, number one, and then number two, continue to then identify, to continue to learn as we use the test in clinical practice, how it can refine decision making for clinicians and patients.
Yeah, absolutely. It gets back to that whole point of innovation and why it's so important. So have tests that are well designed and then are used appropriately, that people understand what a result means, what a positive might mean, correlating it with other standard diagnostic modalities, but then learning from that and continuing to innovate. And so that brings us back to FDA and how we'll be probably working in a slightly different environment in the future if the FDA rolling goes through. Of course, we definitely will be, but it's important and we need to do it for our patients.
Yeah, it is important. That's number one. We should stay focused on that. And kind of going back to that though, it's so ironic to have this whole conversation And to think about the FDA's assertion is that they have the authority to regulate lab developed tests as medical devices. And what with the conversation we had doesn't really sound like a medical device at all, number
It
one.
really doesn't, does it?
No,
Plus,
and
a
that's
laboratory developed test is really performed in a clinical setting, in a laboratory setting with a full quality system. It's a system. It's not just a test. It's
that's
not a
right.
device.
But it is important, I think, number one, that holds true as long as we stay engaged as part of our profession to being engaged with the clinical delivery of care, right? So if we see our job as just running the test and putting results into a medical record, that's really then we're falling short, right? And that's
Yeah.
number one. And number two is really think about the value that diagnostics create for patients. And it's not just FDA. We haven't talked about it for a while, but there's also reimbursement and PAMA and there's other things. And it's just really important for all of us that we continue to reinforce the value of what we do. And part of that also is making sure the tests are used appropriately, because I think that is one of the concerns around this test and these sorts of tests is that a lot of people are worried about that if they have Alzheimer's, right? But what's the best setting to use a test like this where we don't fully understand how it performs? We have to be responsible stewards of the resources as well.
Well, it just reiterates the point I've made in the past that we are part of the clinical care team. We're not just a service. We shouldn't be. We should be actively involved. And we are clinicians working with other clinicians to help care for our patients. Where sometimes
Exactly.
people talk of pathologists as the doctor's doctor, but really the patient's doctor.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Well,
Good place to end.
lots of great points as always, Belle. Well, we will keep everyone engaged on what we learn with FDA. This will be very, very soon. So until then, though, we will enjoy the week. And until next week, Bill, I'll talk to you then.
I'll see you later.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Answers from the Lab. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and don't forget to tune in every Thursday and every other Tuesday.